I will now announce our next speaker, Dorian Gieseler Greenbaum. So Dorian is an historian formed in the Warburg Institute. She's currently teaching postgraduate students at the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. And among her many writings are her book on the diamond in Hellenistic astrology, Origins and Influence, published in 2016, which is the result of her own research of PhD thesis. Since then, she has published numerous books, mostly focused on Hellenistic traditions and Hellenistic practices. So now I give the house to to Dorian, who will be speaking about astrology as a shapeshifter, the roles of divination and science in the history of astrology.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And hopefully you can see this. Slideshow beginning. Okay. So yes, bear with me as I get my notes in order, and I just have a couple of things to say before I get started. First of all, this is definitely a work in progress. And second of all, I apologize for the speed of my presentation. It's kind of a whirlwind tour by bullet point, but I hope it will engender some interest and some commentary at the end. So I'm going to begin with some definitions. I figured we should at least start with working definitions, and I welcome your opinions about these, but for now, divination is what do the gods want of us and how can we achieve it? It is about communication between the divine and mortal. It is information about not only the future, but the past and the present. And in this, the divinatory mode has an erasure of time and space boundaries. There are various types of divination, as Cicero helpfully told us. There's natural or inspired divination, and there is artificial or inductive or deductive divination. And the Mesopotamian corollaries to those would be unprovoked and provoked forms of divination. For science, which in Greek is episteme and in Latin scientia, it's basically knowledge and or the systems derived from it. So, and I was very happy that Chessie mentioned knowledge systems, because I am going to be talking about that too, very briefly. It's conceptual or theoretical understanding or reflective knowledge or a certain knowledge. In Greek philosophy, it's also often associated with truth. And so this is very distinct from our definition of modern science. So first of all, I'm going to talk about astrology and divination, and then I'm going to move to astrology and science. And here, because astrology is arising out of the astral omen tradition in Mesopotamia, I wanted to share with you a quotation from the Diviner's Manual, which says, "The signs on earth, together with those of the sky, give us signals. Sky and earth both bring us portents, each separately but not different, since sky and earth are interconnected." And I just want you to pay attention to the fact that we're talking about signs on earth and signs in the sky, and signaling us from the gods. And that sky and earth are interconnected. And this sort of implies what became a very popular idea in antiquity, the idea of microcosm and macrocosm. The format in which astral omens were given was in the protasis apodosis form. So therefore, if X, then Y, observation of sky event and correlation with Earth event. And I'll add that in Mesopotamia, astrology uses similar systems of knowledge that would meet the definition of science that I gave in the previous slide. In Hellenistic astrology, Catarchic astrology has associations with the opportune or the right moment, which is called the kairos. And this in the Greco-Roman milieu is an important concept in divination, this right moment, this kairos. It was not always connected to the actual time of the event in astrology, but it can be the moment of its discovery or the moment a question is asked. It has similarities with oracles and the questions posed to them. And the right moment, then I guess we could say, it is both physical and metaphysical. For most astrologers, a mechanism of physical causation is not relevant. Outcomes depend on circumstances, but ways of responding to events are up to us. Astrology can show the what, but the how is in our power. For the astrologer, multivalent meanings and opportunities have to be addressed in interpretation, which we could also call judgment. Now, there are connections also in Hellenistic astrology with other divinatory practices, such as in Manilius, where his circle of Athla connects with Etruscan liver divination, and the same happens in Mesopotamia. For critics of astrology, they are quite happy to associate astrology with divination and artificial divination in this case. And here we can read the arguments of Cicero on that. Carneades attacked Chrysippus's views on divination and astrology, and Sextus Empiricus also weighed in. And finally, we could, I guess, say that Augustine delivered the coup de grace for astrology in late antiquity. One of the main concerns seems to be the association of astrology and astrological outcomes with fatalism, and therefore astrology as a form of divination allows only for an unchangeable outcome, and its decree is final. That's their position, not necessarily what's really going on. And finally, a good portion of modern scholarship on astrology and in the history of astrology as well, tends to assume that astrology is a form of divination and proceeds accordingly. Now, I thought that it might be an interesting idea to look at what ancient astrologers call astrology. And I'm just going to give three very short examples. For Manilius, he calls astrology so glorious a thing, or such a glory, tantum decus. And he says that humans sought knowledge of the heavens and noted that all things moved to the divine ascent and disposition of the cosmos. Divine ascent is numen in Latin. For Vettius Valens, he talks about the divine and revered theory of the heavens, and he calls astrology the most divine science that possesses an everlasting, irrefutable, and eternal foundation. So, this is not too far away from the working definition that we have for science. But for Ptolemy, he understands astrology to be a stochastike techne, a stochastic art, like medicine or navigation. And we are going to see this view reappear in the Middle Ages in the concept of a conjectural science. So those are the astrologers, but I also thought it would be interesting to look at what place and what planets do astrologers associate with astrology. So we have the ninth place, where we see doctors, astrologers, haruspices, dream interpreters, philosophers, mystics, and diviners. And the planet associated with astrology, which is Mercury, or Hermes, of course, is linked to orators and court doctors, and also haruspices and priests and magi. So the astrologers themselves are talking about using a knowledge system in their work and in their interpretations, but they're hanging around with diviners. So that's an interesting thing to think about. I'd also like to say very little about this idea of signs versus causes. Remember that in the Mesopotamian systems, we're talking about signs, heavenly and earthly signs. The signs versus causes argument becomes more prominent after Ptolemy, of course, in his bid to show astrology as physically caused. But I do want to say that for astrologers, the use of poiein to make and semaine to signify does not necessarily signal their belief in a physical causation, because they use these words interchangeably in astrological texts to describe effects arising from astrological considerations without any particular epistemological or ontological significance. I mean, they're just practicing astrology. And while Ptolemy is busy finding a physical basis for astrology, in other venues, such as Neoplatonism, Plotinus writes a treatise on whether the stars are causes, and he comes down firmly on the signs side. Iamblichus in De Mysteriis advocates catarchic astrology for beginning theurgic rituals, finding the opportune moment, the kairos, but also refers to astrology as mathematicae episteme, the astrological science, and he tells us that all epistemae have come from the gods to humans. So the back and forth continues between a divinatory perspective and a knowledge system one. And since Ptolemy has brought up the idea of astrology as a stochastic art, oh goodness. Okay, here I am. Sorry about that. Yes, I'm going to talk about and compared it to medicine. I want to say just a few words about astrology and medicine. At first, divination and medicine, because there is an apocryphal Hippocratic letter that says divination and medicine are close kin, since Apollo is the one father of the two arts, and he is also our ancestor. Apollo is also called iatromantis, healer, diviner, and Empedocles is also called a healer and a diviner. And there are use of divinatory techniques such as dreams in healing temples in Greece and the wider Mediterranean area. And these happen in incubation practices used in healing temples. There are also medical practices that use divination and also astrology. In pre-Hippocratic medicine, we have incantations and ritual purification in temple settings and oracles in a medical context. And in the Hippocratic material, we find the use of astronomy, especially in moon phases for critical days, and dream divination in, for example, the treatise on regimen 4, and that's used as a medical therapy. Galen, who has a rather complicated relationship with astrology, he's both anti and sometimes for, does mention it in his treatise on critical days, and moon phases are a part of this, because like Hippocrates, he also espouses that the moon phase theory in critical days, and like Hippocrates also, he uses fever to pinpoint the beginning of illness, and that this is when people take to their beds with fever. So this is equivalent to the astrological practice of decumbiture. He also has a hypothetical example of applying astrological doctrines to the effects of critical days, using the lunar squares and oppositions from the moon's position when the illness begins and referring back to the natal chart. So even in the works of the Hippocratic writers and Galen, who are certainly linked to scientific approaches to medicine, we find evidence of the use of divinatory techniques. So now I will start talking to you about astrology and science, and I'll begin with Christianity and astrology. The Christian fathers, by and large, saw astrology as divination. They associated it with polytheism, which of course was anathema, and astrology also became the work of demons and a double curse upon it. For many of them, astrology was only fatalistic and denied free will. There is an example to this general tradition, and that's in Thomas Aquinas. And here I will refer you to Del Rutkin's excellent article on this in a recent issue of the Journal of Divination and Prognostication. Aquinas says that it is licit to use judgment, astrological judgment, as long as it has to do with natural phenomena. Can't have any interference from demons because that is divination, and that is, of course, a sin. He creates systems to judge these phenomena without interfering with free will, and he tries to make it as licit as possible and provide workarounds to legitimize the practice of astrology. And so astrology as a science in regard to the natural world was important to him. In Arabic astrology, interestingly, we have the words for astronomy and astrology are ilm al-nujum, the science of the stars, and ilm akam al-nujum, the science of the judgment of the stars. And under astrologers like Abu Mashar, astrology became even more systematized and coherent as a knowledge system than it had been before. It seems that the characterizations of astrology as an episteme, a science, had been taken to heart during the translation movement within Greek and Latin and Arabic. And we should note that the judgment made by the astrologer was also part of the science. Meanwhile, astrology as divination for religious reasons and the supposed denial of free will was deemed illicit by the church. This included natal astrology and some forms of cathartic astrology, such as interrogations, and astrology in association with magical practices. Permissible forms of natural astrology were universal or mundane, used in almanacs and elections and weather forecasting and some political arenas. And there were also certain licit astrological practices in medicine, which were taught in universities from the 12th century to the beginning of the Enlightenment, including in Bologna, a little text on judging urine astrologically without even seeing it. Decumbiture charts were also used licitly in medical practice, as were natal charts, as long as they were in the service of medicine. And here I want to just take a couple of minutes to discuss some ideas in an article by Alexander Fedora called Divination and Scientific Prediction, the Epistemology of Prognostic Sciences in Medieval Europe. He talks about the 12th century scholar Gundusalinis, who says that astrology is more noble than other forms of divination like geomancy or hydromancy, and he calls it a scientia judicandi, a science of judging. He defines astrology as a science which describes the course and position of the stars according to the conjecture of humans in regard to the knowledge of times. In Fedora's view, this demonstrates a move from a mode of divine cognition, as in divination, to human cognition, secundum hominum opinionem. And this is a position, I would say, this is my editorial comment here, denying a divinatory mode of cognition that could be argued by some and some in this room, and I would be one of them. But we'll leave that to later. Fedora notes the close connection between the epistemologies of divination and astrology on the one hand, and of medicine on the other. And he cites Albert the Great, who says that the connection between the two is because of their concern with signs, not causes. We've heard that before. So astrology, therefore, as well as meteorology and medicine, uses a semiological mode of cognition, not a causal one. Albert calls this scientia conjecturalis. So we can hardly keep from thinking of Ptolemy's stochastike techne and astrology here. And Ptolemy was an important source for Albert. Scientia conjecturalis remained influential during the Middle Ages, and we should note that the concept was also influential for Aquinas. So let me see, where are we? Next slide. So thus we see astrology embraced as a scientific knowledge system in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. It was used in political circumstances and military contexts and for rulers and the other things that I've already mentioned. However, astrologers were still relegated to the eighth circle of hell in Dante's Inferno. I just want to mention two early modern figures, Kepler and Galileo, who, in addition to their astronomical work, were both interested in astrology. Kepler in reforming it, but also seeing clients, and Galileo using astrology in his personal life. And now we come to modern astrology, where there becomes a debate, sorry, can't talk anymore, on divination or science. I would say sometime in the middle of the 20th century, astrologers sort of bought into the science paradigm, and we see work of people like Michel Gauquelin trying to prove astrology statistically. We see John Anthony West writing the case for astrology, and we see books like Astrology, Science, or Superstition. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, we have Geoffrey Cornelius's radical proposal of astrology as divination, which met some resistance, I would say. It's still somewhat controversial, but has received more acceptance over the years. So I'm going to close by asking the question of whether we can see astrology as a tertium quid. So astrology as a knowledge system that uses a divinatory mode in judgment. Thank you. Stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you, Dorian. Again, a lot of things to discuss and to debate, a lot of point of views to fuel the following discussion. Yeah, I think, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.